Oh, good morning. Looks like somebody just put a message in the chat window. Okay, I might just see if I can share my slides, put those up. Hopefully everybody can still see that. Okay, perhaps it's time I got started. I know everyone's got other sessions they want to see. So the title of my presentation is Progress and Pitfalls on the Path to Decentralization. And this is really a presentation around decentralized identity. And from Anonymity Labs, if you know the history of Anonymity Labs, we're really a privacy company. We're looking after people's safety and their privacy and their security while they're online. And so we've come at decentralized identity from the point of view of privacy and cyber safety. So, and people come from it from different angles. We probably agree with some people who think that decentralized identity is probably one of the most important issues or the most important technologies for the next decade for privacy. So I think it's really applicable for this conference. So I'll go on to the next slide. I wanted to start the presentation with just talking about what's been happening in the news lately. And by lately, I mean really just sort of December and January. In fact, I've just got two slides of some different, kind of events that have happened, but I really could have probably put 5 or 10 slides together. This is just a lot happening in this space. The first one that I think is really interesting is the Avast acquisition of Evonym. So people who have been in the decentralized identity space for a while really know that Evonym is one of the leaders in decentralized identity. And it's really interesting that Avast, which is a cybersecurity company known for things like malware protection and antiviruses and scanning and things like that, has actually acquired Evonym to build a decentralized identity business within Avast. And so that's probably kind of quite a big acquisition this year. Another one on the right there is Salesforce. So Salesforce has actually acquired a company called Credential Masters. And Credential Masters is a company, quite a small company in relationship to, say, Evonym is quite a small company, but their focus was on, being able to issue and validate verifiable credentials and be able to manage those. And it's interesting that Salesforce acquired that company and is putting that technology as part of the Salesforce platform. The next one is one down the bottom on the left there is Checked, and this is a new decentralized identity ledger that was started, I think, in December, and it's something that Anonymity Labs is part of. We're one of the validators on that network. The thing that makes it interesting compared to previous decentralized identity blockchains or ledgers is that it actually has kind of a token as part of that. So there's a check token. And the idea is if you're running the network or you are participating in it, say running applications on it, you use this token to be rewarded for that effort. So for example, we run a check validator node and we can earn check tokens for doing that. And then when we run applications across it, we can spend those tokens or earn more tokens. If you have a look at the one at the top there on the left, W3C. So, does the W3C still believe in Tim Berners-Lee's vision of decentralization? So this is a kind of an interesting one. This is actually an article by Evonym. And inside the W3C, there is an effort to standardize decentralized identity. And they're really at the last stage of getting that approved, that standard. And Google, Apple, and Mozilla have objected to that standard. Now, one point of view is, they have legitimate technical reasons for, going against that standard. An alternative view is that, companies like Google really don't want to see decentralized identity make its mark because it really is going to limit the amount of personal information they have access to. If you look down on the bottom there, Square releases a white paper. So Square, or it's now called Block, Jack Dorsey's company, is building a decentralized Bitcoin exchange. And you can go and read the white paper for what they're building. But the thing that really stands out is, 70% of that white paper is talking about decentralized identity. So they're talking about DIDs and verifiable credentials and all the things that you would normally do in decentralized identity, and that I'll talk about in this slide. So that's a really interesting one of using that technology for an exchange. Another one on the right there is another acquisition, Ping Identity. And people have been in the identity and access management space for a long time. Understand that Ping Identity has a platform for centralized and federated kind of single sign-on. And now they're adding decentralized identity as a third pillar to that. So that's, again, a significant where decentralized identity and identity and access management are coming together. So what is decentralized identity? And so I looked around for different definitions of it to kind of explain it. And I'm going to go through the technology, but I think this one is a really excellent one. Decentralized identity is an approach to identity and access management, IAM, which we've been familiar with for the last 20 years, that seeks to allow individuals to manage their own personally identifiable information instead of using an essential authority. An important goal of decentralized identity is to create standards that will allow internet users to control which applications and services can access to specific types of PII. So the things that kind of stood out to me on this definition is, first is IAM. There really is, this is really the third model for identity and access management on the internet. The first is the one that we commonly know, what we would call a centralized model. You go to a site, you sign up with a username, password, give them some personal data, and you can access that service. Another one is the federated model, or what they would call social login, where you might go to Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn, create an account there, and then you do a login with LinkedIn or login with Twitter or something to another site. And that's what they call the federated model. And the third model, of course, is decentralized identity. The other thing that's important about this is the fact that it says PII. Really the focus of decentralized identity is to control and limit the PII that is used by a service and what you're providing. So it's putting the user back in control of that and letting them decide what gets shared. And if you have a look at these slides, actually, you'll see all these URLs on the slides. That's if you want to go and read some more about that area. So why decentralized identity? What's important about it? Well, let's look at it from 2 points of view. The first is the user. Users have real ownership of their identity. When you're using a centralized or federated model, really the identity is sort of created and owned by the service or by the Facebook or the LinkedIn. And at any time they can delete that. The difference with decentralized identity is the user creates their identity, they have cryptographic keys, and then they can interact with services with that identity. So the identity is with the user, and they can do things like create connections to services. They can be issued verifiable credentials. They can present them, but the user is controlling everything. They also can decide what sort of PI they actually give over. So when they're, for example, presenting a credential, they can say, look, I'll present the whole credential, or different fields in the credential, or they can do what's called a zero knowledge proof, which means I can prove some information about myself without actually giving that away. And the last one is this technology called identity hubs, where a user can store their PII in an identity hub and provide it out to services when they want to. And even services can store information about the user in the user's identity hub. So that's kind of a pretty new concept around decentralized identity. Why is it important from a business and government point of view? Well, they can secure connections with users and other services. One of the key areas is it's now passwordless for users. So a user that comes to a service and wants to be able to access that service can do what's called a DCOM connection. They can get end-to-end encrypted messaging and flow of information between that user and the service. And that same sort of technology is also used from service to service or user to user. So DCOM is just a standard protocol for any of those connections. And a business can issue verifiable credentials. I could be Costco. I might want to issue my members a credential that they can use in other places. And they can also validate those credentials. And probably another important aspect is that an enterprise can try to reduce the amount of PII data that they store. And this is probably not an obvious benefit because, up to a few years ago, enterprises, wanted to collect as much personal information about you as they could. They wanted to have hundreds of pieces of data if they could. These days, it's becoming more and more of a liability. And so organizations really should be minimizing the amount of personal data that they hold. And DI approach naturally helps with that. So what does it look like from a user's point of view? And I actually just picked a wallet from an organization called LISSI, L-I-S-S-I. And I think they've got a nice wallet that kind of demonstrates what you can do with decentralized identity. If you start on the left there, you create connections between a user and a service. And so every time you want to access a new service, you create a connection with that service and you store that connection information, then you can access that service. And so on the left, you can see the kind of a list of connections. Next to it, you can see credentials. And verifiable credentials is probably the most important part of decentralized identity, where you can be issued a credential like a driver's license, a passport, as I said, things like a Costco membership, anywhere where you would normally get some sort of, plastic driver's license, something, you can get a digital version and you can hold it in your wallet. And that's what it's showing you there is the wallets. And if you look at the top there, you can pick wallets or connections. The next one is you presenting a credential or some information to a service. And this is just kind of demonstrating that the user is in control. When the service asks for some information, the user is prompted to say, do you agree with this? And maybe you can provide some of that information or a subset of that information. Or you can say, no, I'm not going to provide you that information. And then the view on the right there is basically just a history. So you'll be able to show, who you've had connections with, who you've presented credentials to, what sort of information has flowed between you and a service. Now, I want to now talk about the technology involved in decentralized identity. So I've got a few slides on that. And the diagrams here I didn't create. These actually came out of an organization called Trust Over IP, which I recommend you go and have a look at. And Trust Over IP is really an organization trying to bring everything together around decentralized identity. And if you go and have a look at it, it kind of reminds you of like a TCP/IP stack where you have these different layers and they kind of talk about which technology lives in each layer. So you've got important concepts like DIDs, so a credential issuer, credential validator, a user, a service, all will have some sort of decentralized identifier. And so DID is pretty important, and then those DIDs can be written to a blockchain. How you write to that blockchain or that ledger or decentralized file system, as long as it's immutable, is determined by a thing called a DID method. And a DID method describes how to kind of read and write from that blockchain or that ledger. And the reason why immutable is important is, you can create an identity on there and then anyone can go and have a look at that identity on that ledger. And by that identity, it means identifier, maybe a link to you, maybe your public key. It doesn't have any personal information on that ledger. And some of the important verifiable data registries are on the right there. And I've kind of just listed 4. And 3 of them, the top 3, Anonymity Labs is part of. So we help run the Sovereign network, we help run the Indicio network, and we help run the Check network. And the different types of networks. So Sovereign and Indicio are called Hyperledger Indy networks. And there's all technology about that. Checked is actually a Cosmos network with Cosmos Tender network. And the difference, as I said before, is Checked actually has a token. So as a validator, you earn tokens and you can spend tokens if you want to use the network. So it's a little bit different to Sovereign and Indicio. And so we've got validator nodes, Anonymity Labs on those 3 networks. Another one, which I kind of think is important, is also one by Microsoft, which is the ION network. And it's actually a Bitcoin-based network. And as yet, we don't run a validator or do anything with that, but that's one we're probably looking at in the future. But these are the sort of networks where, they become the foundation of doing decentralized identity applications. Another important concept is one called DCOM. And DCOM is really the core of everything in decentralized identity. If 2 users want to communicate with each other, if a user wants to access a service or 2 services want to communicate, then they do it over DCOM connections. And you have your own decentralized identity, that other party has one. You go through this connection protocol of setting up new decentralized identity identifiers, and then you can start communicating securely. And that DCOM, as I said, is the basis of all decentralized identity communication. So, for example, if you want to connect to a transport department to be issued with a digital driver's license, you would do a DCOM connection to that department. Probably the most important concept in decentralized identity is verifiable credentials. And this is really, all of the projects that are out there are really focused on that. I think, that's kind of the main area. And so let's just talk about different parties. So it starts, if you have a look at a party on the left there, the issuer. So the issuer wants to issue credentials. So again, it could be a digital passport, or it could be a driver's license, or whatever it is that wants to be issued. They need to talk to the verifiable data registry or the blockchain, and they need to get their credential definition written to the blockchain that references some sort of schema, and they will put their own DID for that issuer. Then the user will come up to the issuer and say, look, I'd really like a digital driver's license. They have a DCOM connection. They get issued their digital driver's license. They then become the holder, and they store that in their wallet, as kind of showed you with that Lissy app. Once you've got it, you can then turn up to a verifier. So let's suppose you've got your driver's license and you want to turn up to a bar and prove that you're over age. Then you again would have a connection between you and their system. They would then request access to either your whole credential or some part of it, or request a zero knowledge proof with you. You as a user, you agree to that, and then that information is passed over to the verifier. And the verifier can check the validity of that verifiable credential, again, by going back to the verifiable data registry or the blockchain and be able to see things like the issuer did. They can look at the credential definition and other information like that. So that completes it. A really important concept is that the verifier never needs to communicate with the issuer when they're verifying credential. And so you've got that anonymity. I've been issued a driver's license. I can present it in 100 different places. And the only places that know that I've done it is each of those individual verifiers. So that's kind of an important concept in verifiable credentials. Another concept which is probably a little bit more sensitive, or a little bit more kind of not agreed on, is this idea of an identity hub. And Microsoft really, and you'll see those two links there, are really leading this effort. And they have a Azure-based identity hub. But the idea here is that you store your information, your personal information, in the identity hub. You can put documents there and other contact information about yourself, and it lives up in the cloud. Then when you go to a service, you can selectively release some of that information to that service. And another aspect of it is that service can use your identity hub. So, for example, if you're on Twitter and you're in your profile and creating information there, you can actually say, Twitter, don't store that there in your systems, store it back in my identity hub. And again, so that if Twitter gets hacked later on, your personal information isn't living there. It's secured up in your identity hub. And so that's the purpose of that. But there is a little bit more controversy on identity hubs, and it's not everyone accepts that it's part of the decentralized identity standards. So what are some of the standards groups involved here? W3C is obviously kind of the most important, prestigious perhaps, where they have the Decentralized Identity Identifier, so the DID standard is there. The verifiable credential standard is also in the W3C. DIF is another organisation, really important, Decentralized Identity Foundation, and they have a whole bunch of groups, and those groups to do two things: create standards and create reference implementations. And so there's a whole bunch of groups, things like identifiers and discovery, DID authentication, claims and credentials, DID communication, side tree, secure data storage, etc. So a bunch of these groups, and each of them working on specs. And also you go to GitHub under Decentralized Identity, and you can see kind of reference implementations. Linux Foundation is a really important part of Decentralized Identity, and there's kind of a couple of places there. First, there's Hyperledger, which is really a part of the Linux Foundation focused on blockchains and ledgers. And you'll see things like Hyperledger Indy, Hyperledger Aries, Hyperledger Ursa. These kind of standards are based in Hyperledger Group as part of that Linux Foundation. It's also the place where Trust over IP is. And as I said, Trust over IP is really trying to bring all these disparate efforts together in a kind of consistent stack that also has both the technology stack and a governance stack. And then Sovereign, and Sovereign is the one I talked about earlier, where again, Anonymy Labs is running a validator node on the Sovereign network, and the Sovereign network is aimed to be a public utility for decentralized identity. So if you've got your schools and your universities or whatever application you want to run on there, you can run it on the Sovereign network. So it's kind of considers themselves a public utility for decentralized identity. And let's talk about some projects now. Here's a really important one by IATA called TravelPass. Now, TravelPass is sort of come into being in the last couple of years through the COVID pandemic, and it's a way for doing things like digital passports and digital vaccine certificates that you can use as you're traveling around the world. And these are all the airlines that are partaking in that project. So that's, I think, one of the most important projects out there, and really it's about the verifiable credentials and what you can get onto your phone, for example, and then in an electronic way prove that you've got this passport and these COVID vaccines and things like that. And you can see there's quite a lot of players in that space. Here's another one called CU Ledger, or Credit Union Ledger Project, and it's called memberpass. The reason why I think this one's interesting is it's almost not so much a privacy as a sort of security project that's based on decentralized identity. And what their aim is to allow a member either to go online with their decentralized identity or use it, say, with a help desk. And we know the problems with things like help desks is, you ring them up, they ask you all this information, your mother's maiden name, what was your first school you went to, things like that. And, there's a number of problems with that. One is it's really quite painful for a user to go through that process every time. You spend minutes answering questions and you hopefully get them right. Two is that generally, if you want to impersonate someone, it's not that hard to find a bunch of information about them so that you can kind of impersonate someone. And it's expensive for the organisation, has to go through that process. So instead of that, they're trying to use the decentralised identity technology to get strong authentication of a user into that memberpass system. And so they're using it as a way to be sure that a user is who they say they are without having to answer a whole bunch of questions. They can just do authentication through that technology and have strong authentication, and then be able to have a really efficient way of accessing that set of credit unions. Another one is the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework. And again, I could have done a whole lot of different projects here, but I just wanted to do different styles. This is a government one in the government in Canada. And from a government point of view, it's probably the leading project. I mean, there's some other great projects out there in places like Germany, but this one is probably one of the largest projects. They do a lot of work in terms of the specifications, in terms of doing reference implementations, putting a whole lot of open source work out to places like GitHub. And it's the idea here is that individuals and businesses and government can all interact in a trusted way, using DIDs, using verifiable credentials and those other standards. So it's a way of making it easy for Canadian customers and private businesses and government to be able to all interact in that way. So I think that's a really good example of a government project. And then I guess the next question is how does the privacy legislation affect decentralized identity? Well, it kind of doesn't directly, but it is the driver. If you think about GDPR, it is the most important, most comprehensive privacy legislation in the world, and really does impact every organization around the world, because everyone wants to do some interactions in Europe, and so they have these data privacy principles, and so all of that effort to have allow users to act more privacy helps drive the adoption of technology like decentralized identity. But then you can see real examples of where it does impact. If there is a thing called a sovereign transaction endorser agreement, and a sovereign transaction endorsement agreement is something that you sign if you want to be able to write to the sovereign network. I want to be able to write DIDs, I want to be able to write credential definitions, things like that. You need to sign a sovereign transaction endorser agreement, and that one specifically says you cannot put personal PII or personal information onto that network, right? And that comes about because of the right of erasure within GDPR. You need to be able to delete your personal information. Well, you can't if you put it on a blockchain, because obviously it's immutable. So that agreement says you won't put any personal information on the sovereign blockchain, which I think is a great thing. If you look across the US, it's much more of a kind of disparate set of privacy legislation there. So that's a great diagram I got off the New York Times. Possibly the most important legislation is the Californian legislation, and again, it's the biggest market, important legislation, like similar to GDPR, and does impact a lot across the states. Again, it drives the privacy technologies, and then there's other documents out there like the NIST Zero Trust Architecture, which says assumes there's no implicit trust granted to users based on their location in the network. So the idea is, if you're on the network, doesn't matter where you are, even within an organization, you still need to have strong authentication. And decentralized identity really does provide that to a user. So what are some of the hurdles to overcome in decentralized identity? So, in Anonymity Labs, we've been involved with it for probably 2 to 3 years since we, first joined the Sovereign Network and started to build a bunch of software in this space. But it's still, it's not a mature technology and it's still developing. If you have a look at the standards, they're developing across a bunch of areas, and there's still, kind of disagreements and more work to be done. A great example is that the W3C has a verifiable credential standard, but there's also, another alternative called anonymous creds, and there's, a lot of code, a lot of running code that implements that. The interesting thing there is anonymous creds is, kind of a code implementation, and now they're going back and writing the standard, whereas the W3C has written the standard and want to get implementations of that. So, maybe we'll have 2 different types of verifiable credentials available. Another one that I mentioned before is this concept of identity hub. Is it part of decentralized identity, or is it something off on the side? And that's something that there needs to be broad acceptance around the standards and implementations of that. So, so you can say there are just a couple of examples, but there's a lot of work to do over the next few years in terms of, solidifying these standards and also finishing some of the standards as well. Another big issue is user key management. So in decentralized identity, right, you need to have a wallet, you need to be able to create a DID, create key pairs, store connection information, store verifiable credentials. Now, it's great with mobiles because, mobile is a great place to have, an application like Lissy, which you can do all those things on your mobile. But what if you want to go and do some work from a web browser? How do you get access to that wallet, those keys? Do you need to be able to somehow synchronize that wallet into the browser? Do you need to have some sort of backup of those keys and that wallet to a cloud service? How do you do multi-device? All of those questions all need to be answered in the decentralized identity space. And the last one is ease of use. It's interesting when you're a technical person, you work in decentralized identity, you understand concepts like DIDs and DCOM and verifiable credentials and zero knowledge proofs and all that. But if you're a normal user, none of those concepts are important to you. You just want to be able to use it. I just want to be able to give a Costco credential, and then I want to be able to use that Costco credential. I want to be able to give a digital driver's license and then use that digital driver's license. And so, there needs to be a lot of work in how do we make this very simple and easy for a normal user to be able to use without having to understand any of the decentralized identity concepts. And so what's the future of decentralized identity? I think acquisition is an important part of that. As I said, I think I talked about 3 acquisitions. I think it was Avast of Evanim, Salesforce for Credential Master, and then Showcard by Ping Identity. So I think we'll see a lot more acquisitions over the next couple of years of these larger organizations wanting to get to the market with decentralized identity capabilities, but needing to get there quickly and not having the time to build it. So there'll be those acquisitions. Another one is Web3, and the checked that network is a great example of that. Here we have kind of decentralized identity, which is kind of already a decentralized technology with blockchains, and then we bring in the kind of the tokenization, so things like Cosmos and Tendernet, and those kind of token economics, I guess you might say, bringing together with decentralized identity. So I think you'll see a lot more happen in that space around the kind of decentralized identity technology and kind of the Web3 technologies coming together. Another one is Internet of Things, devices, and probably the most important thing here is the ability to be able to get rid of the certificate authority. Instead of the devices can register themselves on a blockchain, have a DID there and have a public key and be able to do DIDCOM communication between devices or devices in a server. And so its place in the world for Internet of Things, I think, is really important. Another one, which is obviously very topical at the moment, is digital voting. How do we make voting safe and have high integrity? If you want to be able to vote from home, how does somebody know that it's really you? Well, decentralized identity provides a lot of those capabilities that you have strong authentication to the system to be able to do perhaps digital voting that way. So that's something that's been talked about quite a bit. And then the last one, healthcare. How do you get access to your record? How does an insurance company get access to information? And, things like DIDs and verifiable credentials could play a big part in healthcare in the coming years. Okay, so that brings me to the end of the presentation. I might stop sharing and then see if there's any questions there. Okay, I'll have a look. So I'm just looking at some questions. Oh, I can see some in the chat there. Let's have a look at Q&A as well. So I'll look at there's a question in the Q&A, and it says, do you view legislation as the driver that will be required to gain adoption of SSI tools by firms who view PEI gained via authentication as first-party data? How else we gain wide B2C adoption? And I think the answer to that actually is no. I don't think legislation is required. Like, I do think legislation is important, but it's not required. If you think about having a digital driver's license and being able to present that, or a digital passport that you can take on your phone through airports, being able to get things like a Costco credential that I can then apply maybe to a gym to get a discount. I think there's a whole business and, efficiency and convenience that this provides that doesn't require legislation to enforce it. So I think that it can go ahead without strong legislation that actually demands it, for example. And legislation doesn't talk about decentralized identity, but it does drive that technology point of view. I'll go and have a look at the chat now, just see what's in there. Another thought, I wonder if there's a possible web of trust feature to be had here to avoid identity theft, some sort of privacy preserving way to vouch for someone's credentials and collect these vouchers. So there actually is a very, very good point around a web of trust. And there is some work, and there's actually an initiative called CARI that talks about a web of trust that you can vouch for another one, and then they sort of gain credence. And I think if you go back to PGP, probably 2 decades ago now, there was that web of trust concept. And so there is the idea of web of trust within decentralized identity as well. Also an opportunity to disrupt I can hardly say the word, oligopoly. I can't say that word. They put data at the risk of credit bureaus in the US. So these ideas of kind of monopolies around space, around things like credit bureaus, and also I think disruption in these organisations like the Googles and the Facebooks. I think this could be a disruptive technology to them, because those organisations only exist by knowing everything about you and being able to sell that information. And I think credit bureaus are probably the same. So I think that's an important point. That's why I think decentralized identity, has been said is the most important technology in privacy in the next decade. And it's hard not to agree with that, because it does open up a whole lot of avenues that we don't have at the moment. And then obviously there's a note there about ease of use is critical. Otherwise, it'll never reach a commercial scale. And I think that is really important. And that's one of the points I was making. Even all the technology, you look at Lissy and you think that is a beautiful app, but it's actually showing you the concept of decentralized identity. And I wonder if there's a way of you using decentralized identity without knowing about DIDs and connections and credentials in the same way. Okay, I mentioned this a while back, but what's the take on Tim Berners-Lee's Solid? How does that fit? It's actually interesting that the Solid initiative has been talked about, but it's, I'm probably not the right person to answer this question, but it hasn't really got a lot of traction in the decentralized identity space. If you look at the standards around it, they don't really reference that work that's being done in Solid. So it's actually a very good question, probably something I need to do a bit more research into, see whether there really is some overlap there between Solid and if it's driving any of the work in decentralized identity. I'm not sure that it is at the moment. And another point there, it's centralized but owned by the user. Yeah, I guess the decentralized, one aspect of decentralized, one aspect of centralization versus decentralization is where the account is owned. So if you go to a website and create an account there, that's considered as centralized identity management. You'll create an account on that service at any time that service can create it. You go to the next service and create it. And so each of those services are really in control of it. the decentralized part is that you can control it, you can create an identity, even put it on a blockchain if you want to, and then you apply it to these different situations. And that there's kind of a decentralized feel to that, rather than the ownership being over with those organizations. I just want to see if there's anything else here. Let me scroll up a bit. Let me have a look. What else is here? There's just some comments here. Well, let me just go right up to the top. How many of these systems protocols support the notion of roles of avatars? That is, I want to have multiple identities that I present to the world with potentially different sets of data, and some of those will be explicit known, some will be pseudonymous, and some will be anonymous. You're basically describing Anonymous Labs. If you know what Anonymous Labs does, what we do, we create these avatars or these personas, and you can have multiple of them. I think I have about 8, and use them for different things you're trying to do in the world. Decentralized identity fits in that really well, because there's no reason that each of those personas, like I have a travel persona that I use for travel, that persona can also have a decentralized identity that you use for those applications in that space. So I actually believe that decentralized identity and the idea of personas or different compartmentalization for your life really are very, very nicely sit together. And if you have a look at good wallets, a wallet should be able to provide the capability of having sort of multiple wallets, multiple DIDs, multiple verifiable credentials, each attached to a persona. So that's actually something that's really at the heart of Anonymous Labs. That's what we do. People know our MySudo app. It's about creating these multiple personas, and decentralized identity fits in really well. And that's actually how we've come at it, to say a persona can be used in a centralized and federated way, but why not? It can be used in a decentralized way as well. What else is there? Separating issuer. Yeah, it's a really good point here. Separating the issuer from the verifier is critical. Otherwise, it will become the next license plate reader in terms of privacy risk. Yeah, and that is actually something that people really stress as one of the values of decentralized identity. When I go to an issuer and issued a credential, let's say it's a driver's license or a passport or a Costco or whatever it is that you're getting, right? When you present it, the issuer doesn't know that you're presented it. You go and use it wherever you like. The verifier can verify it. They know that the integrity of it. They can ask you for parts of the data from it, but there's no need to report back to the issuer. So there's no loss of privacy through using these credentials, and I think that's really important. Just seeing what else is here. Where it says there's just kind of a comment about Identity Hub proposes a centralized provider for all, but a powerful user controls. I think the idea with Identity Hubs is there could be many Identity Hub providers out there, and the standard is all about the interface to those Identity Hubs. So I could go to a Microsoft one with the Azure network. I guess it could be Amazon and Google and all these different ones. You pick where you want your Identity Hub to live. And the idea is that it is up in the cloud, and there could be obviously multiple instances of it for high availability and all those things. But the idea is that you can control the data that you put up there. You can control the release of the data and applications. You can even allow applications to use your Identity Hub as well. So I think it's kind of a neat idea from my point of view, but some people disagree with that idea. Well, interesting. Is anything else? Let me just scroll down. That might be all of them that I can see. Is there any other? I'm just trying to look in the Q&A channel as well. No more questions there. Nothing more in the chat. Is there any sort of final questions or anything from people? Okay. Well, maybe we leave it there. And thanks everyone. I think I've used about 41 minutes, so pretty close to 45 minutes. And I want to appreciate everyone that's attended today. Looks like there's more than 20 people attending, which is great, and I'm sure there'll be a recording of this. But thanks everyone. I just wanted really to sort of bring people up to date in the area of decentralized identity. It's really important to Anonymous Labs, and we really kind of see it as part of our future, a really core part of our future, because we're all about providing users with that privacy and cyber safety. So we think it's really important technology, which is why we're kind of been investing in it for the last 2 to 3 years. And so, we're solid believers in decentralized identity, and maybe after watching this, you might start to think about it for your own organizations, whether you're a, kind of a producer of that sort of technology or a consumer. Maybe you want to issue digital credentials, and this might be something to look at. So I think that's everything. Well, thanks everyone again, and enjoy the rest of the conference. It's been great having the opportunity. I want to thank the organisers for allowing me to talk on this topic today. Thanks everyone.